Welcome back to Jack and Rex Tales.
The morning the letter found him, Jack Thompson was sitting behind a roadside diner on an overturned milk crate, sharing the last of his black coffee with a German shepherd who deserved far better than this life. The alley smelled like grease and cold concrete. A thin frost had settled overnight across the dumpsters, across the cracked asphalt, across the old wool blanket folded beneath Rex's paws. Jack's breath rose in small clouds. He hadn't slept much. He rarely did anymore. The kind of sleep that actually rests a man, the deep, safe, dreamless kind, that had left him somewhere around the time he'd left the army. Some nights he could almost remember what it felt like. Most nights he just watched the dark and waited for morning. Rex lifted his head suddenly, not alarmed, just alert, the way he always was before something changed. Jack heard footsteps at the mouth of the alley. He looked up slowly, the way a man looks up when he's learned not to expect anything good. A woman stood there, county lanyard around her neck, envelope in her hand. She was scanning the alley like she wasn't sure she had the right place, like she wasn't sure a man like this should be on any official mailing list. Her eyes found him. She hesitated. "Jack Thompson?" she asked. Jack set his coffee cup down on the crate beside him. "Depends on who's asking." She took a careful step forward. "My name is Sandra Hollis. I work with the Harlan County Probate Office. I've been trying to find you for 3 months." Jack stared at the envelope for a moment before he reached out and took it. His hands were rough, cracked at the knuckles from weeks of cold weather and outdoor work. He turned the envelope over slowly. The return address was official, stamped, real. He frowned. "What is this?" "It's easier if you read it yourself," she said quietly. Then, softer, almost gently, she added, "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Thompson." She left him alone in the alley with the envelope, and the dog, and the cold morning air pressing down on everything. Rex moved closer, pressed his warm side against Jack's leg the way he always did when something was shifting.
Jack opened the envelope slowly. The document inside was formal, legal language, dates and property descriptions and official seals. But there was one name in the middle of it all that made everything else disappear. Eliza Ward. His grandmother. Jack sat very still for a long time. He hadn't spoken that name out loud in years, hadn't let himself think about it too long. Eliza Ward had lived her whole life on a small piece of mountain land deep in the Appalachian foothills of eastern Kentucky. She had raised chickens and kept a garden and talked to her horse like he was family. She had believed the mountain was alive, that it remembered things, held things, carried stories inside its stone the way old people carry stories inside their bones. Jack had loved her once, the way a boy loves the safest place he knows. And then, at 17, angry and restless and desperate for something bigger than quiet mountain mornings, he had walked away from all of it. He had joined the army. He had told himself he would go back someday. Someday never came. The letter told him simply that Eliza Ward had passed away 2 winters ago, that she had left no other living family, that her property, the cabin, the land, the woods that climbed the ridge behind it, now belonged legally to him. Jack read it twice, then folded it carefully and slid it back into the envelope. Rex was watching him, those steady amber eyes that had seen everything Jack had seen and somehow still managed to look at him with patience. Jack reached down and scratched him slowly behind the ears. "Looks like we're going home, old boy," he said quietly, "if it's still standing." The bus ride took most of a day. Rex lay across Jack's boots on the floor of the coach, his big head resting on Jack's ankle, rising and falling with each slow breath. Outside the window, the flat land gradually gave way to hills, and the hills gradually darkened into mountains, and the mountains rose up on both sides of the road like walls from another world. Jack watched it all and said nothing. Memories came back the way they always do, not all at once, but in pieces.
The smell of wood smoke on a cold morning, the sound of his grandmother's voice calling him in for supper. The way Sage, her old Appalachian horse, used to stand at the fence post in the evenings like he was watching for something only he could see. Jack remembered the last morning he'd left. He remembered his grandmother standing on the porch in her worn house dress, her gray hair pulled back, her hands folded in front of her. She hadn't cried. She wasn't that kind of woman. She had only looked at him with those steady, dark eyes and said, "You'll come back when you're ready, Jack. The mountain will wait." He had nodded like he believed her. He had never gone back. Now, 33 years later, he pressed his forehead against the cold bus window and felt something in his chest that he hadn't let himself feel in a very long time. Something heavier than regret, heavier than grief, something that had no clean name, just weight. Rex shifted against his boots. Jack closed his eyes. They reached the property near dusk. The road that led off the main highway was barely a road anymore, more like a suggestion. Gravel and mud and tree roots breaking through the surface. Jack walked it with Rex beside him, both of them moving slowly through the fading light, the cold mountain air sharp in their lungs. The cabin appeared through the trees as the sun dropped behind the ridge. Jack stopped walking. He had prepared himself for ruin, for collapse, for a pile of rotted wood and broken memory, but the cabin still stood. The porch had caved in on one side, and the roof sagged low over the left corner, and both front windows were gone, just open frames letting the cold inside. But the walls held. The stone chimney rose straight and solid against the darkening sky. The structure had refused to fall. Jack stood there for a long moment, just looking at it. Rex sat beside him quietly, not pulling, not moving, just present. "She built it to last," Jack said to nobody in particular. He pushed the front door open slowly. The hinges groaned, and something else beneath that. Something faint and familiar that Jack couldn't name, but that settled in his chest like a hand placed gently over his heart. Rex stepped inside first. He moved through the room carefully, reading the air the way he used to clear buildings overseas. Steady, deliberate, thorough. Then he stopped in the center of the room, looked back at Jack, and relaxed. Safe. Jack found wood beside the old cast-iron stove, dry enough. He built a small fire and fed it slowly until the warmth began to push back against the cold. Then he sat down on the floor beside Rex, his back against the wall, the fire crackling low in front of them. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was inside four walls with a roof above him and heat beside him. He didn't say anything. Neither did Rex. They just sat together in the firelight and let the night come down around the mountain. Morning arrived with frost and absolute silence. Jack stepped outside into the pale early light, Rex moving beside him through the tall, wet grass. The valley below was filled with low mist. The ridge above was dark against a gray sky. Everything was still. Then Rex stopped. His ears came forward. His body went quiet in that particular way, focused, reading. Jack followed his gaze toward the tree line. The horse stood at the edge of the woods, half hidden in the shadow of the pines. Old, impossibly old. Ribs showing faintly beneath a coat that had gone rough with age. Mane long and tangled, hooves thick and uneven, but standing. Still standing. Jack's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Sage." The horse lifted his head slowly at the sound of the name. Jack walked toward him carefully, one hand out, palm open, the way his grandmother had taught him when he was a boy. Sage watched him come without moving. Then, when Jack was close enough, the old horse lowered his head and pressed his nose gently against Jack's open palm. Jack stood there with his hand against that old soft nose and didn't trust himself to speak. Rex had come up beside them. He didn't bark, didn't circle. He simply sat down in the frost-covered grass and watched the two of them with calm, patient eyes. After a long moment, Sage lifted his head. He turned and began walking slowly toward the woods. Jack frowned. "Where you going, old-timer?" Sage kept walking, then stopped and looked back over his shoulder. Rex glanced up at Jack. That same look, the one from before missions, the one that said, "Pay attention." Jack let out a slow breath. "All right," he said quietly. "All right, let's see what you're trying to show us." They followed Sage deep into the woods behind the cabin. The trees grew close together here, blocking most of the gray morning sky. The ground sloped upward. Jack's boots broke through the frost with every step. Rex stayed close, reading the air, his breath rising in small, steady clouds. After nearly 20 minutes of walking, Sage stopped in a clearing. A stone shed sat at the edge of it. Small, old, built into the hillside like it had grown there. The wooden door hung crooked on its hinges. Deep scratches scarred the surface around the lock, like someone had tried to get in or tried to keep others out. Jack pushed the door open. The smell hit him first. Cold stone and old metal and something chemical beneath it all. When his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw them. Stacked nearly to the low ceiling, wooden crates with metal-reinforced corners stamped with a company logo he didn't immediately recognize. He pried one open with a piece of broken shelf board. Inside were metal cylinders, heavy, each one sealed and labeled with coordinates and depth measurements and dates going back decades. Core samples. Jack had seen them once in a documentary about mining operations. Geological core samples pulled from deep underground to test what was down there. He picked one up slowly, read the coordinates stamped on the label. Then he looked down at Rex. "These coordinates," he said quietly, "they're pointing right beneath this land." 3 days later, in the office of a retired geologist named Dale Humphrey in the town of Harlan, Jack set 3 of the cylinders on the desk and waited. Dale examined them for a long time. He didn't speak. He just turned them slowly in his hands, reading the labels, checking the samples inside against a reference book on his shelf. Finally, he looked up. "Where did you find these?" "My grandmother's land," Jack said. Dale set the cylinder down carefully. He folded his hands on the desk. "Son," he said slowly, "what's inside these samples is lithium-bearing ore, high concentration, the kind of deposit that mining companies would spend a fortune to access." He paused. The kind of deposit someone would want to keep very quiet. Jack felt something go cold in his chest. How old are these samples? The dates on these labels go back 40 years. "And nobody drilled on that land officially," Jack said. "I checked the public records." Dale nodded slowly. "Which means somebody drilled without authorization. Somebody found what was down there." He looked at Jack carefully, and then somebody buried the evidence. Jack sat very still. He thought about his grandmother, about an old mountain woman who had tried to tell people what she knew and been dismissed, disbelieved, forgotten. She hadn't been confused. She had been right. And she had held that proof in a stone shed in the woods for 40 years, waiting for someone to come and carry it forward. The lawyer Jack found was young and underfunded and working out of an office above a hardware store in town. Her name was Claire Ashworth, and she looked at the core samples and the documentation Jack had gathered, and she said, very quietly, "This is real." "I know it's real," Jack said. "They're going to come at you hard," she said. "This company has resources. They have lawyers who make more in a month than I make in a year." "I know that too," Jack said. Claire looked at him. "Why not just take the settlement, whatever they offer?" Jack was quiet for a moment. Rex was lying near the office door, his head on his paws, watching Jack with those steady eyes. "I served with men who didn't make it home," Jack said finally. "They believed some things were worth the cost." He looked at Claire.
My grandmother spent 40 years being called a liar. She deserves better than a quiet settlement and a buried file." Claire held his gaze for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen. "All right," she said. "Let's go to work." The case took 7 months. The Energy Corporation denied everything first. Then they offered money, a private settlement with conditions of silence attached. The number was significant, enough to rebuild the cabin completely, to live without worry, to never spend another night behind a diner on an overturned milk crate. Jack thought about it one evening, sitting on what remained of the cabin porch, Rex lying across his feet, the valley lights flickering far below in the darkness. He thought about it seriously, honestly. A man who had been sleeping outdoors for years had every right to think about a number that large. But when he closed his eyes, he saw his grandmother standing on this same porch in her worn house dress. He heard her voice telling someone, a county official, a neighbor, anyone who would listen, about what she had found. He saw their faces, patient, dismissive, the particular expression people use when they've already decided not to believe you. He pushed the contract back across the table the following morning. "No deal," he said simply. Former workers came forward. Old internal records surfaced through the legal process. The company's defense began collapsing under the weight of its own buried truth. The final settlement was substantial, but Jack's condition was non-negotiable. The land itself would remain protected. They could access what was underground through responsible means. But the mountain, the trees, the water, the forest his grandmother had loved, would not be touched, would not be cleared, would not be destroyed. The company agreed. By the following autumn, the cabin stood strong again. New roof, solid windows, a small, warm barn at the edge of the property where Sage could finally rest out of the weather. Jack had done most of the work himself, the way his grandmother would have wanted, carefully, slowly, with respect for what had stood before. On the door of the old stone shed, he mounted a simple wooden plaque. He had written the words himself, standing alone in the clearing one quiet evening with Rex sitting beside him in the leaves. The plaque read, "Eliza Ward. She told the truth before anyone believed her." The first time Jack read it on the finished door, he stood there for a long time with his hand resting against the wood. Rex leaned against his leg. The forest was completely still around them. "I should have come back sooner," Jack said quietly. Not to Rex, not to anyone standing there, just to the mountain, just to the air. "I'm sorry I made you wait so long." The wind moved through the pines above him, slow and soft, almost like an answer. Most evenings now, Jack sat on the rebuilt porch as the sun went down behind the ridge. Rex lay at his feet, gray around the muzzle these days, slower in the mornings than he used to be, but still present, still steady, still the most faithful thing Jack had ever known. The valley below filled with shadow as the light faded. The mountain rose dark and patient against the sky. Jack thought sometimes about the road that had led him here. The years of drifting, the cold mornings and the hard floors, and the quiet desperation he had carried without ever naming it. He thought about the letter that had found him in that alley, finding him like it had always known where he was, just waiting for the right moment. He thought about his grandmother, about a woman who had lived her whole life on this mountain and loved it faithfully and told the truth about it when truth was costly, and kept the evidence in a stone shed in the woods because she believed, with the patient certainty of someone who knows they won't live to see the ending, that the right person would come eventually. She had left him everything, not just the land, the purpose.
"You were right, Grandma," Jack said softly into the evening air. "The mountain remembers." He scratched Rex slowly behind the ears. Rex let out a long breath and pressed his head heavier into Jack's hand. The lights in the valley below flickered on one by one as the darkness settled. And up on that mountain, for the first time since he had walked away from the army and found himself with nothing but a dog and an empty road ahead of him, Jack Thompson felt something he had almost forgotten was possible. Peace. Real, quiet, earned peace. There is something this story asks us to carry with us long after it ends. The reminder that purpose doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives in a torn envelope behind a roadside diner. Sometimes it waits for you in a stone shed in the woods, patient as a mountain, faithful as an old horse standing at the tree line. Sometimes the life you were always supposed to live is the one you walked away from. And the most courageous thing a person can do, more courageous than any battlefield, is find their way back to what matters, to the truth, to the people who believed in them before they believed in themselves. Rex knew it. He always knew it. Jack just needed time to find his way home. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that loyalty and truth and quiet courage still matter in this world, then you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to Jack and Rex Tales and stay with us, because every week we come back to this porch, to this mountain, to these stories that remind us what it truly means to be human. And we'd love for you to be here with us when the next one begins.